The Minds of Meaning Podcast. The Minds of Meaning Podcast. A podcast where we grow together in understanding the unique ways that God has created us. Here's our host, Austin Anderson.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Minds of Meaning Podcast, where we try to understand the unique ways that God has created us. My name is Austin Anderson. This is our third episode in the second season. Today, I talk with Dana Pautsch, who is the Department Chair of Exercise and Sports Science at Judson University, where we record this podcast, and is also currently pursuing her doctorate in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies, also at Judson University. Dana has been studying motherhood and leadership and has some great perspective as she balances her work life, her school life, and her family life. Without further ado, let's listen in. All right, Dana, so as we're talking about your topic about motherhood and leadership, take us through your vocational journey a bit, as I know you've had some pretty significant pivots in career aspirations right after college.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a majority of my undergraduate career, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I felt I had a passion for sports. I had known that since I was a young child. So when I went to Truman State, I was there for volleyball. They had a sport management program, which was a good fit for me, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. And although I had internships and some off-campus experiences, I went into my final semester of undergrad having no idea what to do next. And thankfully, I had a coach who was like, why don't you come with me, be a graduate assistant volleyball coach, and you'd be a great college coach. I was like, yeah, that sounds great. And so that kind of formed my pathway to grad school, thinking college coach was going to be my answer. And it was within about 3 weeks of grad school. I was like, no, this is not my answer. This is not my fit. I didn't really see that career meshing well with the family that I had imagined for myself. And although I had not met my now husband at the time, I just knew it wasn't an ideal fit. So I went through grad school almost as lost as I did in undergrad. And I took some good mentors telling me, one of my best mentors, Dr. John Lubker, who's out at Notre Dame right now, told me, he goes, have you ever thought about being a college professor? And I was like, no. Do people think about that? Is that a career path I need to think about? And that was really the light bulb moment for me, getting in to see what it might look like to be a college professor. I had considered doing my doctorate right out of grad school, getting my master's. It just wasn't God's timing. So I came back home here to Northern Illinois and got my first job out at NIU. And I was similarly torn between what I thought I wanted to do, which was now be a college professor, and what I knew already, which was college athletics. So when I started out at NIU, I was an academic coordinator in their student athlete academic support services department, a massive support department for student athletes. And it was a great fit, but it wasn't where I felt like I was being called. And I didn't think it would be where I was long term. And so, again, I had a great mentor while I was there, Dr. Elizabeth Tovar, said, Dana, you had mentioned you want to teach. Do you still want to do that? And so she gave me the opportunity to teach there. And it was through that rejuvenating experience at NIU that I was able to get back into the classroom and give me the confidence to apply to Judson. And so that's what brought me here.
So then obviously you got to Judson, you started thinking about dissertation topics and eventually joining the D-Lead program here at Judson. What ended up leading you to potentially study motherhood and leadership as your topic?
Yeah, I'll say this. I didn't originally think I was going to start my doctorate at Judson. The program didn't exist when I started here 10 years ago. So when it came into its conception and many faculty were like, hey, are you doing this? I was like, yeah, this is an ideal fit for me. But in terms of dissertation topic, I tell you, start thinking about it early on. It's an embedded dissertation program. I really didn't know what that would look like. And so what did I lean to originally? It was athletics and sports. And that's what I really thought I'd be doing originally. But it was Dr. Kroom's leadership theory class that really brought me back to what was important to me. And I don't know if you remember, we had a nice thick text by Nordhaus on leadership theories. It was like 400 pages of theories. And I remember when we were going through those, really not seeing any that fit me. Like I didn't see myself in those theories. And there was one chapter at the very end of the book that was on gender and leadership. And it was that chapter that I just kept going back to and saying, yes, this is where I see myself. This is my experience, not these other 15 plus chapters. It was this one chapter on gender and how my experience as a woman, and then at that point I was a mom, was so different than what was the common leadership norm. So it was really that class. Shout out to Dr. Kroom for having us desire and design our own leadership theory, because that was really the inception point for me.
How do you think motherhood, obviously it very much influenced your background, what you chose, but like how has your own motherhood experience lend itself into really deciding you wanted to study this topic?
Yeah. So when I think back to when my daughter was born, my daughter just had her 8th birthday. So it was about 8 years ago, I had a perspective shift in the way that I interacted with others, that point was really mainly students. I was an assistant professor. And so I just started seeing my students as whole people. I didn't see them as my kids, but I'm like, hey, they have a mom and dad too that cares about them. They have lives that are going on too. And so that perspective shift changed about 8 years ago, but really to lead into a dissertation topic, I started to acknowledge and recognize that other moms were having this same exact experience as me. And there was nothing out there to support or defend why we felt the way we did. And maybe how motherhood could actually be an advantage in the workplace or in leadership. And so that was the pivoting point, was like, why isn't this research out there? Maybe I need to be the one to go start it.
Now that you've been through the process a little bit, have you been able to see the perspective of other moms and not just yourself in the midst of this process?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the dissertation, is to remove yourself from the research process. So last fall, I had interviews and focus groups with 28 women who are mothers and leaders in higher education, and to hear their stories, to laugh with many of them. One woman or two actually cried during the interview because they were just so passionate about what they do as a mom and what they do in their leadership role. And so to hear their stories and now be in the process of writing up and being able to share those stories is outstanding.
And I think one thing for moms in general, or just anyone, but especially moms who are trying to balance everything, time management is something that is obviously very important. You're trying to make sure your kids can make their soccer games and taekwondo while also being able to do all their studies and be a professor. How have you, and then maybe how have some of your people in your focus group been able to balance this all and still maintain sanity, I guess is a nice way to say it?
My first answer is God. I would not be able to do this without the Lord giving me the energy some mornings to get up and do it, and then just the perseverance. But it's also really boiled down to me understanding what my priorities are and making sure those priorities are in alignment with what my days look like. I'm a pretty strict scheduler. I try to keep things on task, knowing what each day is going to bring, and then also looking at when I have those gaps in a day. What can I do to maximize those gaps? Fridays is a perfect example. I leave to pick up my daughter a bit early. Her bus gets to her stop at about 3 o'clock. If I get there 15 minutes early, what can I do in that 15 minutes? Is it read for my next class? Is it go back through some of the interviews? Is it start to think about what I'm going to write when I get back to my laptop? It's just maximizing that time to the best of my ability.
When you had interviews with other mothers, did they provide any insight and strategy of how they were able to effectively use time management at all?
Yeah, I think that one of the moms shared how she's just a list maker. I would say that for myself as well, but she just described how she will start a list at night for the next day. So it is ready to go. So rather than wasting time that next day and saying, oh, I got to do X, Y, Z and spending 15 minutes putting a list together, she already has it done from the night before. A lot of them talked about external resources that they use to help them. So maybe it is childcare providers that they have into their home that can help prep a meal at night. Maybe it is their spouse able to contribute to balancing all of the things that they have going on. It definitely was not a one-size-fits-all solution, which was cool to see. And everyone has their own unique family unit that they're working with.
We think of motherhood in a different light than fatherhood. And so in the midst of that, what obviously we've heard of for generations of fathers being able to do all this stuff, but now with moms, what's the most significant difference between motherhood and fatherhood, you think, in their roles when you have a dual career mentality?
Yeah, that is a great question. And that came up quite frequently in the interviews and in the focus groups. Some of the moms were like, we should do this on fathers, right? We should see what they say. Which, hey, future research that's out there for people who are listening. But aside from that, I think the views and expectations that society places on mothers is different than the views and expectations that society places on fathers. And we're talking working moms and working dads. And you could say mothers in leadership and fathers in leadership. And some of that is just simply with the mental load and home responsibilities that come associated with motherhood. The expectation is that moms are going to carry that mental load. They're going to make sure that the kid is signed up for soccer and they get to soccer and carpool's arranged. And if there's a doctor's appointment to be made, that they make the doctor's appointment and they go to the doctor's appointment. And I think at times that's a disservice to fathers, because there are some very capable, amazing fathers like my husband, Mark, who is able to do those and step into those spaces. But as a society, we don't expect that of them. If I'm maybe having to leave campus early one day, he has 3 kids, that's an expectation. We understand that. If a dad was in that same spot as me, would they be given that same grace and expectation? Would they be encouraged to leave? I don't know. I was talking with my husband, Mark, just last night about this. My son had an ear infection yesterday. He took time off of work to take my son to that doctor's appointment. And then just before that, he had gone to our preschooler's Easter party, and he was the only dad in that space. And so being the only dad there, he recognizes that, but he still jumps in and helps. But when they were wrapping up, he told me, they said, hey kids, your moms are leaving soon. And he got completely ignored because it was not an expectation for him to be at the preschool Easter party. So I think it's a disservice to fathers who really want to be involved and are involved.
you look at women in the workforce versus women who have been more stay-at-home mothers in that regard. Have you seen anything in regards of maybe someone in your focus group spent some time being a stay-at-home mother, or maybe there's a sense in now today's society that these women feel like that they're missing out on something?
Gosh, I just have the greatest amount of respect for stay-at-home moms. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. She stayed at home with us from when I was born until my youngest brother went to school. And so shout out to the stay-at-home moms, because I think that is the hardest job in America. And it is probably the most underappreciated job. To say that those women are experiencing FOMO or wanting to get into the workforce, I think would be a mass generalization that we have to caution. Are there women that would love to get to work, but they're staying home for the betterment of their children or their family circumstance? Absolutely. Are there mothers who are called to be stay-at-home moms and they are doing an amazing job? Yeah, they are called to do that too. And so I think we as an American society do a disservice to our stay-at-home moms by saying that's just unpaid labor. They don't matter. I was just reading an article yesterday by Bloomberg saying that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to start collecting data on the amount of work that women are doing at home, and that's that stay-at-home mentality, because that is a huge contribution to our society. But I don't know. I don't have any mothers who are, obviously I interviewed working mothers. Some of them were stay at home at one point in time. And they did talk about the challenges it took for them to get back into the workplace because they had that gap in their resume. But I also think that could speak to what this research should say, is that how has motherhood prepared them for returning to the workforce? And that could be a possibility as well.
How would you say, at least for yourself and maybe some of the people that you researched on, how is being able to having that multitasking mentality really help apply to your motherhood stage?
Yeah, for me, it absolutely applied. I was juggling multiple sports at a very young age through middle school and into high school. So I do think it is a contributor. Do I think it's the only contributor? No. I think you could be involved in music in that way and be dedicated to lessons and your art and your craft, similar to theater, some of the requirements and expectations of practicing lines and getting into rehearsals. So I do think it is a contributor. I don't think it's the only contributor. One of the moms even in her interview shared how being just a doctoral student and a mom and a full-time employee, she had to juggle. She was forced to. I do think for me, college athletics, probably above all else, really taught me some resiliency in life and being able to overcome adversity, being able to just stop with the excuses and get the job done. And so that level of determination for me came from athletics. I can't speak for all former college athletes out there, but I think a lot of those skills and maybe life application and the ability to multitask, just generally speaking, comes from involvement in activities at a young age and is learning to figure out what their priorities are and how to get it all done.
Looking at another demographic here, the single motherhood, where not only are they doing all these things, but on top of that, they're the lone parent in the household. Did you have any research in that regard? And how does that kind of compare to everything else we've been discussing so far?
I had a few moms who were single, few moms who were separated or divorced, and so they were navigating that single parent lifestyle. Some of them had been in it for a while, and they talked about how that shift was pretty significant when they were divorced potentially, and how that required them to solo juggle everything. So if their kid needed them, even emotionally, right? Grown kids needed them emotionally, they were the person. There was no one else to defer to or default back to. And so that responsibility fell on them. And then I just had a presentation about a week and a half ago at the Advancing Women in Leadership Conference for the CCCU. And one of my co-presenters was a single mom for a while. And she shared how when the burden falls on you to do all the things, it's even harder. So she was sharing how her child's drop-off is 15 minutes before some faculty meetings. And so she is the person who has to take her children to school. And so she walks in late to those faculty meetings because she has to. I do feel like single moms can be at a significant disadvantage that is viewed by their employer, their institution, or even society. They look like, oh, they can't show up to things on time or they got to leave early. That might not be the case. When they're the core parent and they're the ones responsible for those things, the ownership of everything falls on them.
How has your family been able to support you in being able to succeed in this venture?
When Mark and I met, he knew a doctorate was a possibility. So I think he was bought into the idea from the beginning. Now, the when was unknown. So when this opportunity came up, he's like, yeah, go for it. And there's definitely been some hurdles. There's been some hard conversations where I've been at that breaking point where I'm like, I need you to do more. And he stepped up to do more. Even if it's something like, hey, I need you to take some of the laundry this week. Can you help me with some of the laundry? Can you help plan the meals for the groceries? He's been outstanding in that. And I'm very grateful for a spouse who's willing to do more than his fair share of the work at home. But I think that's not just him, right? My parents are helpful. My in-laws are helpful. So when my husband travels, he works too. He was just gone for 5 days for a business trip. My mom came over on a Saturday, watched the kids all day long when I had a class. And then my mother-in-law came over on a Tuesday night when I had class and Mark was still gone. So I just had a great outpouring of support from family, his parents especially, and then even friends who just check in on me like, hey, how's that going? Been thinking about you, been praying for you. It's just so appreciated.
Are there any other examples that you've heard in your research in a similar light of other people really stepping in to help the success of the individual?
Yeah. So in some of the literature I have read, historically speaking, that is one of the key contributors to women being in leadership is a supportive spouse. If that is not there, it makes it very hard for women to move into leadership positions. Several of the married women did talk about how their husbands have contributed, but they also talk about the tension that can exist when both parents are working. And so whose quote unquote job, whose position takes priority in those sentences. And it's hard to navigate. It's hard for them to navigate. But I would say for the most part, women spoke positively about the collaboration and partnership with their spouse.
Any research situations where in a two-parent household where the mom was quote unquote the breadwinner or dad was maybe career-wise not as, say, accomplished than the wife or the girlfriend, were there any discussions about psychological differences or just thoughts as that kind of went about?
We didn't get too much into spouse roles, spouse positions. The one thing, though, that I did hear a lot of the women say is something that they deal with is just the guilt associated with being a working mother, being away from kids, regardless of how old they are, especially when they're younger. I think that guilt is more apparent in having to go back to work, but feeling that I want to care for my kids. I want to be there for their activities. I want to attend all the things that they're doing, but there's times I can't. And so that really came out as prominent for mothers, both single and married, regardless of that marital status, really saying my family is number one. And so sometimes that number one has to be the priority over my job. And if it pulls me away from my job and my leadership role, so be it.
You've been able to have the blessing of being able to work and go to school at the same location. In some respects, helpful. They don't have to go as far. Are there some other cases of people, as you mentioned, there's a couple people who are going for their doctorate or doing other stuff in that regard, where arguably their schedule requires even more transportation between workplace and school in that regard?
I had some former colleagues that got their degree at a state institution. So they would share stories about how they would drive 2.5, 3 hours to class, one class in a weeknight, drive those 2.5, 3 hours back. And that was the norm. And so to be a school that employs me, which is outstanding, but so close to home is such an added benefit because then I am really able to maximize my time. So when I have a class at 5 o'clock, goodness, I stay at home until 4:45, get every ounce I can with my kids. And then my husband and I trade off and I might not see them till the next day because in all likelihood, they're asleep before I go to bed. But the other perk of just being a student at the place where I'm employed is that people know me. People know my situation. People know that I'm a mom. And it is very much a family atmosphere. And there's a lot of perks to that family atmosphere because the care and concern for me as a human is so great all the time. And I don't feel like I'm ever just a student sitting and listening to a lecture or having a discussion, but I'm Dana and I can bring that whole self.
What are some facets that you think, you don't necessarily need to spoil the dissertation for us, but what are some facets of your research that you find fascinating or something that we wouldn't have thought about in terms of motherhood and leadership?
Yeah, I'm not going to spoil all the findings. And I'm still in the process of writing, so this is a fun one to digest. One of the things that jumped out pretty early on was that mothers recognize the unique needs of other people, stemming from how they recognize the needs of their children. And so when they have multiple children, their oldest child is not like their youngest child, and they have to sometimes parent them differently. They have to discipline them differently. They might need to speak with them differently. Even parents of just one child recognized how there's days when I can't talk to my kid the same way I talked to him the day before because the needs of that day are just so unique. And so they were able to make that connection between that parenting skill and using it in the workplace as well. So when they recognize that someone on their team might need more time that day because they're going through something and being able to honor what that individual needs. That was something that just jumped out as, do we ever acknowledge that? Do we ever acknowledge how we relate to each other and see that someone is going through whatever it might be, and individually they don't fit the mold that day, and that's okay. So that uniqueness of individuality jumped out as a pretty early significant finding that I was like, wow, that makes a lot of sense.
Is there anything else in your research where it was psychologically validating? You research something, it's like, yes, I'm experiencing this. I wasn't able to articulate it before, but now I know.
Yeah. So going back to the perspective shift that I had with my students about 8 years years ago, many of the moms talked about how they started seeing the humanity in others and the humanness that we all bring. So this holistic perspective, and you've probably heard me use that term now, because now I'm trying to give it a term. It feels so powerful. When we're able to bring our whole selves into the workplace, we're able to be better employees, better faculty, better teachers, better whatever we're doing. And to dismiss that and say, hey, I know you're a mom, but you need to leave that at the door. What are we losing when we do that? Or, hey, I know you're a child to an aging parent and you're caring for your parent right now. To be able to tell someone you can't bring that to work is a disservice, I think, to the people that we work alongside and people that we lead. So this holistic perspective of humans and employees is something that I was like, oh my gosh, yes, this makes absolute sense. This is what I feel now about my students. So when my students come in with their quote unquote baggage, it's okay. Let them come in with that baggage. Let them come in whatever they might be carrying from childhood or whatever they might just be carrying from the hardness of the day.
Are there any women in leadership that you would say in your research that kind of points towards the pioneering of 25, 30, 40 years ago, where they feel like, in a sense, were some of the first mothers to get a PhD or an EDD, teacher, whatever job, and also be able to be a mother while working?
Yeah, what's sad, you can't go that far back because there really wasn't much around it. I'm thinking like Sally Helgeson in the 1980s was the one who started to look at how female CEOs led differently. And she was the one that paved the way for her book, I think it's called The Female Advantage, understanding how women do maybe lead a little bit different than men. But the other pioneer who really comes to mind for me, especially in Christian higher ed, is Karen Longman. She has been the pioneer for women in leadership and understanding how women do lead differently, how that's okay to lead differently, and how we should embrace that.
Do you still feel like sometimes new ideas and perspectives take a little bit of time to settle in? And do you feel like maybe in church circles, there still is a level of trying to come to terms of acceptance that women in leadership positions is an okay thing? Is there some kind of pull still that you feel, maybe not even just church circles, but other traditional circles, where that is a little bit more of a working aspect to accept that mentality?
Oh, absolutely. If you look back, we can call it traditional circles, whether that's church institutions or organizations, that the thought of putting a female in a leadership position would be like, do we want to do that? Can they do it? Should we do that? What does the Bible say? And I think, again, if we look at how God made us in terms of equality, I think it's important that we start to acknowledge that females have the ability. Just because we don't historically have the places in society, we can't look back and say, oh yeah, we've had a female president, because we haven't. Oh yeah, we've had female dictators and female emperors. And yeah, we can pinpoint women who have come through in leadership. It's just not the norm. And so even in Christian higher ed today, the stat might be a couple of years old, but I'm thinking about how in Christian higher education institutions, about 50% of the institutions have only one woman or less, one or none in their cabinet. And so when you think about academic cabinets, you can have 5, 6, 7, 8 individuals in those cabinets. And then obviously your president, only one woman being represented in those circles shows how it's just not a appreciated or potentially accepted norm that we're seeing in traditional circles.
How have you seen your faith in God grow? Maybe you've learned more about God in the midst of you doing this research.
I would say God has provided me a peace in this presence that I have not felt in my life. I'm a go-go type A person. And so it's always, what's next? What's next? What's next? I felt that way through school and undergrad, through grad school, then even thinking about a doctorate, like what's next? What's next? And I distinctly have felt the Spirit saying, Dana, this is where you are right now and be in this space over the last couple of years. And so it's been nice to not think about what is next and be just so hyper-focused on the doctorate. It's immensely helpful in terms of focusing, but also in grounding, right? God calls us to be present in the spaces that we're in, be involved with those people and whatever we might be doing. And so if we're always worried about what's next, we're losing sight of what matters right now. And so that has been something I've really felt strongly over these past 3 years, but then also just him being able to provide. I was really struggling to start this academic year, just not looking forward to it. For the first time in a while, I've been here 10 years. And so year 10, I was like, was this something about year 10? I'm not ready to go. It was a struggle. And so I had a devotion that I was reading in August in 1 Kings. And it is where Elijah asks a woman for water and bread, and she's got barely enough. And I'm probably butchering this slightly, but go back, get the water, get the bread. And she had the oil filled, the flour filled, and God continued to refill it for her every day. And she always had what she needed for that day. And that is what I have felt in this past 9 months, especially in the dissertation phase of the provision from God, of being able to have what I need for each day. Maybe not in abundance, but I have what I need.
I think that's a good point to think about, where maybe in some of the stories and testimonials that you've had from other individuals, there probably was moments where you would have a feeling of not being able to do it all. Was there a sense when you were talking to some of the others who were doing some focus group research on that they felt the worries and the anxieties of the future, there was some level of really playing a focus in their mind as they continue forward in their careers?
Yeah, a couple of moms pointed to COVID as being a really transformative moment for them because they didn't know what was next. What was this going to mean for them, their families, them in their leadership roles? So they talked about how just juggling the truly working mom life when things shut down during the pandemic as being a significant trial for them. Others talked about how during their divorce, that was a state of unknown for them, and having to look for God's provision and his redemption through those divorce stories was another one. So I think a lot of them found those trials to be significant, but they also knew that there was an end.
A big thank you to Dana for joining us today on this episode. I am amazed at how she balances it all during her doctoral pursuit, and I'm glad to call her a colleague and friend. She will certainly be a resource as I continue my doctoral pursuit as well. A reminder that you can find us on all sorts of platforms. You can find us on Facebook, X, and Instagram at Minds of Meaning. Be sure to find us as well on our website at mindsofmeaning.com. I look forward to being with you all again in May. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the Minds of Meaning podcast. To learn more about Minds of Meaning, visit mindsofmeaning.com or Minds of Meaning on the mainstream social media platforms. God bless.